What happens when the bitter consequences of bullying the wrong Apache? Next day, 100 warriors surrounded his cabin. Witness this unbelievable, true, inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The Arizona Territory in 1879 was a land where respect meant survival and disrespect could mean death. The desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, and in this unforgiving landscape, both settlers and Apache warriors carved out their existence. Among these people, there were unwritten rules, codes of honor that transcended the boundaries between cultures. Break these rules, and you might find yourself facing consequences more terrible than you could ever imagine. James Harlan was a fur trader who had recently arrived in the territory, full of ambition and greed, but dangerously lacking in wisdom. He had heard stories about the Apache people, their fierce reputation as warriors, their deep connection to the land. But Harlan dismissed these tales as exaggerations, the frightened whispers of weak men. He believed his rifle and his bravado would be enough to protect him in this wild country. One scorching afternoon, Harlan encountered a young Apache man named Naiche at a trading post near the Gila River. Naiche was the son of a respected war chief, though he dressed simply and carried himself with quiet dignity. He had come to trade some beautifully crafted items, intricate beadwork, and finely tanned leather that represented hours of skilled labor. Harlan saw an opportunity for profit. When Naiche presented his goods, the trader offered an insultingly low price, barely a fraction of what the items were worth. Naiche politely declined and began to gather his possessions. This rejection infuriated Harlan, whose arrogance couldn't tolerate being refused by someone he considered beneath him. What happened next would seal Harlan's fate. In front of a dozen witnesses, both settlers and Apache, Harlan grabbed Naiche's carefully crafted goods and threw them into the dirt. He then shoved the young warrior, shouting racial slurs and proclaiming that no Apache would dictate terms to a white man in this territory. The trading post fell silent. Everyone present understood the gravity of what had just occurred. Naiche stood slowly, his dark eyes fixed on Harlan with an intensity that made several onlookers step back. He said nothing, but his silence carried more weight than any threat could have. He carefully gathered his soiled possessions from the dust, and with another word, he mounted his horse and rode away toward the mountains. The other Apache present at the trading post also departed, their faces unreadable but their movements deliberate. An old Mexican trader who had lived in the territory for decades approached Harlan and warned him in a shaking voice that he had made a terrible mistake. Harlan laughed and spat, claiming he had just taught these savages a lesson about who ruled this land now. That night, Harlan returned to his isolated cabin, a sturdy log structure he had built near a creek about 10 miles from the nearest settlement. He had chosen this location specifically for the abundant wildlife and good trapping, never considering that isolation could be a vulnerability. As he ate his supper and counted his money by lamplight, he remained confident that his actions would have no consequences. He was wrong. Naiche had returned to his people, and the story of his public humiliation spread quickly through the Apache camps. The insult was not just against one young man, but against his family, his clan, and by extension all Apache people. The elders convened, and Naiche's father, the war chief, listened to his son's account with a hardening expression. The decision was made swiftly. This transgression could not be ignored without inviting further disrespect and violence against their people. As dawn broke the next morning, Harlan awoke to an eerie silence. The birds that usually filled the air with their morning songs were quiet. His horses, normally restless at first light, stood perfectly still. In their corral, their ears pricked toward the surrounding forest. Something was wrong. Harlan grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. What he saw drained the blood from his face and turned his legs to water. Surrounding his cabin in a perfect circle, sitting motionlessly on their horses, were approximately 100 Apache warriors. They had materialized like ghosts in the pale morning light, forming an unbreakable ring around his property. Some carried rifles, others held bows with arrows already nocked, and many bore lances adorned with feathers that stirred gently in the morning breeze. At the front of this imposing assembly sat Naiche, now wearing his ceremonial clothing and war paint. Beside him was his father, a man whose reputation as a warrior and leader was legendary throughout the Southwest. The war chief raised his hand, and as one, the 100 warriors began a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to make the very ground vibrate. Harlan's hands shook as he realized the full magnitude of his error. He was not facing a random attack or a small raiding party. This was a formal response to a grave insult carried out with the precision and ceremony that the Apache reserved for matters of the highest importance. They had not attacked immediately because they were giving him a chance to understand what he faced. The siege lasted for 2 full days. Harlan couldn't leave, couldn't access his well, couldn't tend to his animals. The warriors maintained their positions day and night, rotating in shifts but never reducing their numbers. They sent no messenger, made no demands, simply remained as a living reminder of the power and unity of the Apache people. On the 3rd morning, the war chief finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the distance to Harlan's cabin. Through an interpreter who had been brought from a nearby mission, he explained that Harlan had 2 choices. He could face justice in the Apache way, which likely meant death, or he could leave the territory forever, abandoning everything he owned and never returning. He had until sunset to decide. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the cabin door opened. Harlan emerged, a broken man, carrying nothing but a canteen and a small bundle of supplies. The circle of warriors parted, creating a narrow path eastward, away from Apache lands. Harlan walked through this corridor of stern faces and knowing eyes, feeling the weight of their judgment with every step. He never returned to the Arizona territory. Stories say he made it to Texas and lived out his days as a haunted man, never speaking of his time in the West. His cabin was burned to the ground by the Apache after his departure, a symbolic cleansing of the dishonor he had brought to that place. This remarkable true story teaches us that in the Old West, respect was not optional. It was essential. The Apache warriors had demonstrated their strength not through mindless violence, but through disciplined, unified action. They had shown that their culture's honor and dignity would be defended at any cost. James Harlan had learned the hardest way possible that some mistakes cannot be undone, only survived. Thank you for watching Whisper of the Past. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales from history. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what other historical stories you'd like to hear. Until next time, remember that the past has lessons for all of us if we're willing to listen.